say something?
Hello. Can you see? Can you hear? Hello? Hello? I can be louder. Okay.
Okay, great. Yeah.
There.
It's all right?
Yeah, it's reading right now.
We're good?
I think I have everything at your office. Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to be here for the meeting.
Okay, fine.
Ignore.
Thank you very much. All right. Sorry about the delay. We had a class before this. We didn't know that, and also we had to set up the streaming. So this is going to be streamed live on YouTube, and then if you want to review it, or if you have friends who want to listen to this, it will be on YouTube later on.
Actually,
yes.
you should use the mic too.
Oh, I should use the
Yeah.
mic too. Oh.
We're staying next to it.
Yeah, oh yeah, just stand.
I'll
Stand
just.
next. That'll work.
Okay. Fortunately, Melody is a really close friend of mine, so we can do this without feeling awkward. I'm very happy that Dr. Melody is visiting our campus today, and she will give us a talk today, and then tomorrow we'll have a film screening on Vergara, and then on Saturday morning we will have a dance workshop. So Dr. Melody Yunzi Li is an assistant professor of Chinese studies at University of Houston. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from Washington University in St. Louis, an Master of Philosophy degree in Translation Studies from the School of Chinese at the University of Hong Kong, and a BA in English/Translation Studies from Sun University in China. Her research interests include Asian diaspora literature, modern Chinese literature and culture, migration studies, translation studies, and cultural identities. She is currently working on her manuscript called Trans-Pacific Cartographies, narrating the contemporary Chinese diaspora in the United States. This project examines post-1980s Chinese American literary and media productions by or about first-generation Chinese immigrants in the United States. She has published articles in various journals, including Pacific Coast Philology, Telos, and others. Dr. Li has taught a wide range of courses, including courses on East Asian cultures, Chinese literature, popular cultures, and Chinese language. She is a passionate teacher and has won some distinguished teaching awards and grants, such as the Provost Teaching Excellence Award and the Teaching Innovation Program grant, and others. We are honored to have her here today to give us a talk on confronting Asian American racism. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Melody Yunzi Li. Thank you so much, Professor Li, for the introduction. We actually share last name, but it's actually not the same Li. Hers is Li, and mine is Li. But I'm always grateful for her being my 学姐 and faculty mentor as well. Like, she's been very helpful for many years. I want to also thank Andrew Mellon Foundation and also the Division of Humanities and International Area Studies for sponsoring this talk. And all of you for being here. Of course, I know it's a sunny day in such a wonderful vacation city. I feel like I would have a hard time teaching here. So I'm so grateful that you came to this talk, and I hope it's of some interest to you. It's actually a work in progress, so I hope that you can give me some feedback and we can discuss more after the talk as well. But before I start, let me wish you Happy New Year. Happy Lunar New Year. It's Tiger Year this year, so I wish you well and healthy and successful in all ways. So wish you Happy New Year's. 新年快乐. So it's Tiger Year, but you know that actually in our culture that we are all Asians and Asian Americans are often related to tiger, as you have heard, the tiger mom and the tiger generation, right? So I'm going to talk a little more about that. So today I'm focusing on like confronting anti-Asian, Asian American racism. So I don't know like what's your experience with anti-Asian racism like during this pandemic time. Anyone? Please.
Yes. Yes, I did. Yes, I don't really know. Yes, I don't really. I don't really know any specifics, but specifics because there's not really a large East Asian community in my where I grew up, but I've seen it talked about it a lot. I've seen the model minority theory. I've seen the model minority thing pushed by my mom, pushed either consciously or unconsciously by people I know, including my mom.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you. So I'm sure that you witnessed it like in all ways. So I personally participated in this rally, like anti-Asian racism, right after the Atlanta shooting in March 2021 last year. So this is a big rally in downtown Houston on March of 2021. So here we make like posters and we have like protests. In fact, a lot of you may have noticed like a lot of like anti-Asian racism during the pandemic from your Asian friends. And here, like I noticed in 2020 when the pandemic first hit the United States, what I heard in among the Chinese community in Chinatown in Houston is that like they lost a lot of businesses, people were discriminated, they don't want to go to Chinatown, think it's a hunting town. So I remember usually it's crazy full in the parking lot on Fridays, Saturdays in Chinatown, and suddenly there was a lot of parking. So I guess that's a bad thing in some way. So it raised a lot of concerns. I need another PhD in technology. So, in the first 3 months, just 3 months, and there were 1,400 reports in the first 3 weeks. In the Stop AAPI Hates reports. This is a publicly accessible website. If you go on like AAPI, you could see a lot of incidents. And actually 60 of these were non-Chinese reporters mistaken to be Chinese. And 46 stories with incident reports, and 16% attacks were due to Asian Americans wearing masks. And we can talk a little more about that, about the mask as well. Masking was seen as related to Asian culture for a long time. Therefore, it became a political thing in some way. So of course, you all know that the Trump administration was a big part of this discourse. As you see, in all his scripts in the House, he would change COVID-19 or coronavirus to Chinese virus and Wuhan virus. So he spoke about it multiple times. And this also led to the big increase of anti-Asian racism during the time. And as this student, sorry, what's your name?
Caroline.
Caroline. As Caroline mentioned, that's like we all.
Yes. Never mind. Yes, I also have to note that there's a significant South Asian community where I grow up, and even and my mom often like once said that about one of my somebody I went to school with.
Mm.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so she raised a good point about like different Asians as well, like which we talk about. And Caroline mentioned the model minority as a like common conceptualization of Asian American community in the United States. As you all heard, we are often seen as the hardworking, higher paid professionals. And however, these conception was changed into into a lot of, and again, the rise of tiger nation, right? This is how we are associated a lot of times as Asian and Asian American community, right? Like the highest income, best educated, fastest growing racial group in the United States. We would also go through the history of that in a little bit. From this model minority, all of a sudden during the pandemic, we are related and often associated with this masking virus. And this is a picture that on October issue of 2021 Journal of Asian American Studies, one of the biggest conference in Asian Americans. And this, on the cover is this girl with a mask and the scarf. And on top of it, it writes, "I am not a virus." Right? This is the emotion that a lot of Asian Americans feel during the pandemic. Therefore, it is an important issue to address, of course, because this pandemic, crossed borders, yet also the epidemic of hate, right, of anti-Asian and anti-Asian racism. So today I will cover some of these topics. Well, of course, it's, I can talk on and on about each topic, so it's like I would just generally cover some basics. So the rise of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, and we want to say that anti-Asian racism is not new. I'm sure a lot of you know this is a historical concept, and also it's a historical problem. So to talk about that, I will go through some Asian American history and the research on it, and racism story map during the pandemic time that we are working on, and then bring in some of the suggestions, and I hope we can lead to a Q&A that's about some of what we could do. So about Asian American studies, I'm sure a lot of you already have a lot of background information. Just like Caroline had this, she raised like South Asian. So a lot of people like maybe misconceived us as, Asian as a big group, or or mistaken. I was mistaken as Japanese in Hawaii. I was mistaken as Korean in somewhere else. So it happened to me a lot. Well, sometimes I'm happy about it. Sometimes I feel weird about it. So Asians is a very big concept, right? So of course we have East Asians, South Asians, Central Asians. It refers to anyone who originates from Asia. However, it's an always evolving concept. In 2010, there were more than 70 million Asian Americans from about 20 different groups. That's 5.52 of the total population. And the largest groups were Chinese, and then Indian, Filipino, followed by Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. I want to talk a little bit about the past, just so we know that anti-Asian racism, again, is a historical problem. It's nothing new, right? And how that relates to the current. So as you all know, the earliest Chinese immigrants came to the Gold Mountain, right? You all know where's Gold Mountain? California, right? In fact, I grew up as Cantonese in Canton, and I was told to marry Gamsan uncle. You know what's Gamsan uncle? Gamsan in Cantonese is Gold Mountain. So the Gold Mountain uncles who came back after digging gold were rich. So when I grew up, I always heard this, well, you guys should marry Gamsan uncle. I felt it very strange and curious, and that's how I got into all of this. I also grew up in overseas Chinese village with my grandparents who were first generations of a lot of overseas Chinese from Vietnam, like Southeast Asia. So I got more and more intrigued by the Chinese diaspora community in general. So my ancestors, Gamsan uncles, they went to California in 1800s, the middle of 1800s, to dig gold. And then here you see Transcontinental Railroad. So they played a big part in the building of Transcontinental Railroad, along with the Mexicans. However, at that time, we can see the growing fear of Asians. So after the build of Trans-American Railroad, they were actually discriminated and sent out. So you cannot stay in California. So go to other cities, they escape to other cities, or they have to go back to China, or a lot of them like died on the way. So the yellow peril was a long-term concept that I'm sure many of you have heard. It's a threat to the community. We were seen as this like threat that we take the job and stuff like that. So one of the most important acts is Chinese Exclusion Act. It was built in 1882 up until 1943. And of course, there are also other acts and agreements for other communities, like Asian communities, like the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, which says Japan would stop issuing passports for new laborers, and Immigration Act of 1924 banned most immigration from Asia and restricted the quota from people from Asia. So if you look online, there will be a lot of these images. They're actually political cartoons that describe how Chinese immigrants were discriminated and banned during the time of like the 19th century. So as you see here, this is like Chinese man in this like old style clothing, and then going back, have to get away from Missouri and then go to China. And then there's this mailbox like chasing him, and then says Chinese must go, and then he has to carry a stool. And you know what he's carrying actually? The laundry, right? Like that's how like the laundry did that time. So that was also a stereotypical Chinese, like Chinese industry during the early time. And of course, there are a lot of posters of, the yellow races as danger to the society. This is another cartoon in the Pacific Chivalry, California, like newspapers at that time, and you can see that it's like a white person abuses a Chinese immigrant. So at that time, he has this long queue. I'm sure you saw that a lot, and that was a queue from like the Manchuria area, like in Ming, and then they remain this queue, and then it's. This is also seen as the feminized, like the Chinese male figure in the United States, like they lost masculinity, and this as seen as outdated and old-fashioned. So, and then they were kicked out by the Americans. So I don't know how many of you have been to San Francisco. So if you go to San Francisco, do visit Angel Island. I visited there a few times. So you can take a ferry from the harbor from San Francisco to Angel Island. And that's actually, it's a very beautiful island, but at the same time, it records a lot of sad stories of the immigrants. So this is the time when the Angel Island was used to detain immigrants. So if you go there, you can see two buildings. One big building is for the European immigrants, the other big building for the Asian immigrants, and the one for the Asian immigrants particularly have very harsh condition. It's a more torn up building. They have very little food. They will share rooms together, and you can see they have very harsh condition. So on the wall, when I went there, I was actually touched, but also sad that I would see like traces of the poems that written on the wall, and mostly actually written in Cantonese, because like I say, the early immigrants mostly from Canton. So like this poem, detained in this wooden house for several tens of days. It is all because of the exclusion law, which implicates me. It's a pity heroes have no way of exercising their prowess. I can only await the words so that I can snap Zeus with. From now on, I'm departing far from this building. All of my fellow villagers are rejoicing with me. Don't say that everything within is Western styled. Even if it is built of jade, it has turned into a cage. So really, there are actually dance troupes in California that they, like one by Leona Lee, like they did a dance actually on the Angel Island, implicating how the bodies were traumatized during the time that immigrants were detained in the Angel Islands. So a lot of them had harsh conditions. Some of them tried to get away and swim across the ocean, but some of them lost their lives. I strongly recommend this collection. So these Chinese American historians, Hima Lai, Jenny Lim, and Judy Young, they are Chinese American, one of the earliest Chinese American historians. They put together like a collection of poems that they collected from the Angel Islands. So, and they translated it. So this, if you want to know more about the poems, take a look at that. So that was the time in the 19th century when, besides all the things that I talked about, there are also forces that really pull the immigrants out of their homeland to the United States. Like the first Opium War, created a conflict between China and England that ended in 1842. And of course, a lot of you know that there is an agreement that Hong Kong became part of the colony then. Then in the 1850s, masses of Chinese people immigrated to the West Coast and then to work on the gold mines. And in the 60s, many immigrated further to work on the transcontinental railroad, that like the pictures we see earlier. In 1890s, Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos made up the majority in Hawaii. And today, if you go to Hawaii, there are still a lot of plantations that you see from early immigrants. Soon, both Hawaii and Philippines became the American territory. So these all trigger a lot of immigrants to the continental US in the 19th century. And now we skip to the 20th century. And of course, besides the Chinese immigrants, one of the things that we all know a lot is the Japanese Americans during World War II. So in 1942, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 1966, which excluded anyone from Japanese descent to live on the West Coast. So just to clarify, so he actually detained like everyone that's of Japanese descent, no matter you are Japanese American, already a citizen, or just Japanese immigrants. So here is the 1966 issued by Franklin Roosevelt in 1942. So it authorized the evacuation of all persons deemed a threat to the national security from the West Coast. It sounds familiar, right? The phrasing sometimes we still see in today's world. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, including both resident aliens and also US citizens, were forcibly relocated. So as you see, during that time, a lot of Japanese Americans have to hide. They try to protect their child, and it caused a lot of trauma for the community. So this is the extreme condition in one of the relocation centers. I've personally been there. It's in Manzanar. So if you go to San Francisco, it's about 7 hours drive. It's actually a little hard drive, but you will actually go through one of the most beautiful national park, Yosemite. Then it's on top of that hill, but it has extreme weather condition, as you'll see. So it's actually very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer. It goes up to 100 degrees. And of course, they don't have air conditioning, right? So a lot of them passed away, and they, a lot of them, they tried to live through it. So this is the Manzanar Relocation Center. You can see a tomb like this picture online as well. This is a book that I recommend if you want to know more about Japanese American internship, like in the Manzanar, Farewell to Manzanar, documents a story of a girl, like documented from when she was 7 years old, she was relocated with her whole family, with a lot of other Japanese Americans to that internment camp. And So during the time, Japanese Americans were really seen as threats. And of course, along with Chinese Americans, it became another story of discrimination and threats. So one of my papers examines the nightclubs in the 1930s to 50s, and I include this novel, Lisa Xi's China Dolls, which actually talks about the Japanese American and Chinese American nightclub dancers in the very famous nightclub in San Francisco, like Forbidden City. It actually have documentation of that as well. It's very interesting place. I argue that the space is where they could examine their identity, and it's as something that's very complicated. So in this story, it's actually very interesting. There are some Japanese American girls, they were nightclub dancers, but during the time of 1940s and 50s, they were actually called to relocation camps. So there were a lot of immigration officers come in the clubs to look for them. So they actually dress up and pretend to be Chinese American during the time. It's very interesting that phenomenon that at different times of age, like different kinds of Asians were discriminated, and we all pretend to be someone else at some time. So things get better in the 1960s. So that's how we started the Asian American, African American studies. So that's the start in 1966 when the strike happened. I have actually friends that graduated from this San Francisco State College, and they were very proud of that. So that's where the strike happened. So they have the big protests, and they argue, the students argue, we have to have our right. We have to have a get together. And so at that time, they tried to argue for the minority and minority education. So you can find some script. We don't really have a lot of time today to show clips, but you can actually easily find clips on YouTube. And so coming out of this, one of the settlements, among many, is of course the Third World Liberation Front. And the settlement is the college would endeavor to establish a school of ethnic studies operating in this 1969, and will need additional funding. And also, they hire a lot of professors to be in the School of Ethnic Studies, which, of course, it started as with African American Studies, then followed by Asian American Studies. So slowly, in the late 1960s, Asian American Studies start to be included into ethnic studies programs, starting in the West Coast, right? A lot of, from San Francisco State College, and then start to have the UC system. So a lot of professors start to teach Chinese American history, including this historian. He is one of the key historians and very helpful to us in Chinese American studies, Philip Choi. He personally is an architect and historian as well, so he writes on Chinatown in San Francisco. He also, is one of the first ones that established Asian American Studies curriculum. He was very helpful to me back in the day when I was in grad school. When I visited his home, he has one of my favorite home libraries. It's everywhere. You could climb up to all the libraries. So he's very helpful in terms of providing a lot of younger generation scholars, a lot of materials. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. But this is my memory of him. So after the 60s, because of the Immigration Act in 1965 and all these changes, there was an influx of Asian community, Asian immigrants to the United States. As you could see, the percentage rise from just less than half, 0.5 to more than almost 5% in 2020. So as you see, the modern time immigration is still from mostly 1965 Immigration Act. So it abolished all previous bans on immigration from Asia, resulting in an influx of diversity. So after 65, that we often in immigration studies, we call it like a new immigrants, right? That's the one watershed like moment that we call like new immigrants. Then of course, other acts would, also give this rise. For instance, the Lewis-Celler Act of 1946 gave Filipinos and Indians greater access to immigration. Then all the wars in Asia, like Korean War, Vietnam War, and the Civil War in Asia, resulting from immigration, that is the push effect that people are still coming out from Asia. So today's immigrants that, as you see, are a lot of them for first generation coming after the 65 Immigration Act. However, despite the rise of immigrants, there are a lot of things remained from the 19th century. Like a lot of rights were deprived. For instance, we have unfair taxing, poor labor conditions, wages, and segregation, unequal justice, ineligible for naturalization. So today still exists, right? So as we all come back to this topic of model minority, in fact, this term model minority was coined from this story called Success Story Japanese American Style in 1966. So it mentioned this term like model minority. And since then, like Asian Americans are often seen as model minority. In my article, We Are Not Virus Challenging Asian American Racism, I do argue that model minority and yellow peril, or the anti-Asian racism, was actually the two sides of one coin, right? In fact, it is used in the same way, but at different times, to facilitate the mainstream discourse in some way, right? It is in another way racism. And of course, microaggression, which we see during the pandemic, is also not new. A lot of my friends in Asia American, they are Asian Americans in California. They are here for generations, but they are often asked on the street, anywhere, where are you from? It's like, California. Where are you actually from? All right? I'm sure some of you would experience this, or your Asian friends experience this. Or they would say, you have good-looking eyes, or you look like Japanese, right? So there are a lot of different, different stereotypes of us, right? In some way, we could call it like microaggression. So, and of course, like we still have those common immigrant problems like language barrier, cultural shock, cultural isolation, health problems, and access to health and other benefits. So of course, one talk is very hard to cover everything, but I want to give you some access to some resources, great resources, that if you're interested in looking in more, you can look into. So these are the ones that examine earlier Chinese American history. Entry denied, talk about, like during the time of Chinese Exclusion Act, during the time. And claiming America and transnationalism, I put these two together because when we talk about in the 60s, when Asian American studies became like starting to rise in California, and we can, at first they talk about this theory of claiming America. So in order to become successful Chinese American, we have to assimilate into the society and become American first. So that is like early on in the 60s up into the 90s. That's the theory that focus on. However, after the 90s, there is this transnational chant and global chant. So therefore, in scholarships, a lot talk about transnationalism and transnation and diasporic, right? So since then, it's more talking about Asian Americans as part of transnationalism and the transnational flow. Oh. Not wanting to move. This is a pretty good history book of Asian American history, so by Ronald Takaki, like Strangers from a Different Shore. If you're interested in literature, like I do, then this Elaine Kim is one of the key scholars in Asian American literature. This book, Asian American Literature, An Introduction to the Writings and Their Social Context, is a very good general overview, and it also collects a lot of works by Asian American writers. Here, Articulate Silences I think, is one of very phenomenal work because it mentioned this notion of silence, right? Which I will touch on a little later as well, which still exists as one of the problems. Immigration Act, one of the key scholars, Lisa Lowy, she mentioned that we are perpetual foreigners within, right? So she mentioned the citizenship notion. Asian American Studies is one of the key associations, and the Journal of Asian American Studies is their journals. Please take a seat here. And if you're interested in CLIA studies, these are very good work on Asian American and CLIA studies. And of course, there are Filipino American and works on Hmong American. Cool. Okay, well, I hope, I'm trying not to run over time. But the Pleasant, so we are talking about the anti-Asian racism still exists in today's world, besides all the fact that I start my talk with and anecdotal that you see in today. So collaborating with other field faculty, we are working on story map that documenting anti-Asian racist incidents in California, New York State, and also Texas. So this is a work in progress. So as you can see, there are a lot of smaller incidents, microaggressions, and we can find a pattern of these three states as well. Okay, this is Texas. As you can see, actually there is a huge problem in Texas data. So New York is actually the state that has the most data and publicly accessible data. They are also the earlier ones that collect this data. So we actually come up with this problem, a lot of problems during collecting the data, finding because it's, a lot of people actually are not reporting the anti-Asian racism. So let me see. I think this is just a small clip. Yeah, so there are some that indeed share their stories, and I'm sure you can easily find more as well. Oh, sorry. Oops. Feel like. Okay. So this website, Asian American Advancing Justice, actually tells a lot of stories of the anecdotes of what happened during the. It starts acting out. Like this quote. So these are some of the stories. About 7:30 p.m. on Tuesday evening, I was exiting the train subway station in the Long Island City when a female behind me came up the subway, steps moving me and telling me to go back to China. He made eye contact with me and said, China doll. And then after I walked past him, he said, China doll, sucky, sucky. Don't want to read it. You're not fooling anyone. I'm going to come out and beat you. I can do that. So all these incredibly.
Has anybody ever used the N-word against, you know?
N-word?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't, like, personally, I don't come across, but yeah, I'm sure in anecdotal stories, yes. But that's one of the problems also of these anti-Asian racism, because we don't have enough reports. As you see, this is newspaper of ProPublica. Actually, it shows, you know, this, like Houston, where I'm from, America's fourth largest city, only reported 8 hate crimes, and Harris County, it reported 0. And you know that's not true. So there's a lot of underreporting issue, and that's why this idea of silence, you know, in our culture, but also there are a lot of threats. But why are we not speaking up? You know, sometimes don't know what to do, afraid things will get worse. Nobody else is doing anything. I'm afraid it will get identified, right? Because when we are like vulnerable, sometimes it's really hard for us. However, if you or your friends really have witnessed any incidents, please do report. Well, we need the data for research too. Besides that, it's important to speak up. Right, so this website, Stop AAPI Hate, is the nonprofit organization started during the pandemic in California. Their website do have very easy access to reporting, so do report it. So last, I talk about some incidents of xenophobia and racism, what we can do as humanities scholars. I'm sure a lot of you here, sitting here, humanities scholars or taking classes. Right, so we are lost in limbo. People like Asians like us, I cannot go home during the last 2 years or see my family back home. So it's really hard for us. Like here, we had faced some racism, and there it shut the door behind us. So we lost in limbo. However, during this time, then what do we learn, right? We ask some of these questions. Will we go back to the globalized world? And what is new normal after all this? So as humanities scholars, we think humanity must strive to protect basic inalienable rights as citizens of the states or global citizens. And the Chinese and other Asian diaspora community and the literature are of great value and understanding of the importance of preserving such rights. So I want to show you some example what people do during the time that what I call rebuilding home among this hardened border during the time. So these Asian diaspora writers, some of them, they really, like in their writings and blogs, they have a lot of writings that educate the readers about the anti-Asian racism, right? Like to reveal what the anti-Asian racism is about. And sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's more obvious. Also, it's shared experience, right? During the time, the hardened border and what they come through, they really share this experience and form a community of our own as diaspora community. Of course, there are also like this journalist, like she reclaimed this power of reclaiming the Asian name. Right, so we didn't feel it was that important, but it is. And of course, during the time of pandemic, not only Chinese diaspora literature are writing about the stories, but also Chinese writers. This is one of the famous writers, actually got more famous during the pandemic because she documented the life in Wuhan during lockdown. So this Wuhan diary created a lot of controversies in the among Chinese community. But she quickly got recognized and supported by Chinese diaspora community, and then a lot actually followed her suit and document lockdown stories and pandemic stories in different way. And of course, most importantly, writing down, reporting, speaking out during all this time, I hope including what I'm doing today, give us a sense of non-physical homecoming. As one of the writers I studied says, he's Ha-Jing, he writes in The Writer as Migrant, only through literature is a genuine return possible. Well, yeah, especially important during the time we can't go back. So, as humanities scholars, educators, and students, we cannot stand at the front line to fight with the nurses and doctors, but I hope we can raise all these problems, the issues that we mentioned today, racial discrimination, ethnic problems, and like ethnicity, all that through literature. And we too can form a community and belonging through literature, art, film, and by sitting here. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody, for that great talk, and it's very rich as you talked about what happened in the past, what's happening